Hi, I'm Jonas. Welcome to the presentation. I'm working for Eclipse Source. We are a service provider building IDEs and tools for our customers. And in this role, we observe a rapid shift from mostly desktop-based tools 5 or 10 years ago to, I would say, 80% cloud and web-based tools in 2021. So we mainly focus on this topic. And as we get in contact with a lot of customer projects, we see a couple of recurring questions, like frequently asked questions when you get in touch with a topic. And today's presentation is actually targeted at answering the most important topics there. So that's why I called it Getting Started with Eclipse Cloud Development Tools. Three disclaimers about this presentation. I only have 25 minutes, including or with an additional 5 minutes of Q&A. I won't be able to tackle all the questions. I'm focusing on the most frequent one that we have to answer, that we answer. Also, I cannot provide all necessary details on most of those questions because some questions I could easily do a separate talk about, for example, comparison between VS Code and Theia. But my goal for today is actually to provide you an initial answer and then some pointers for follow-up resources that you can look at, for example, talks at this conference, articles, and so on. And the final disclaimer, I tried to order the topics a bit during this presentation. For some of them, it works. So there is some flow in the presentation, but sometimes we completely have to switch topics. So if you know Monty Python, it's like now to from something completely different. So excuse me if there are some complete topic breaks during the presentation. All right, let's dive into that. Enough of disclaimers. So essentially, this is about the question how to build web-based and cloud-based tools. Now, many of you might have tools on the Eclipse desktop tool platform, which was very nice and cozy. It was very obvious how to do that. And now you want to go to the web or the cloud, and there are a lot of new technologies like Theia, VS Code, LSP, Eclipse Che, and many, many more. Now I would like to provide you some insight and some overview of this emerging ecosystem. Let's start with a very basic question that comes up a lot. What is actually a web-based tool and what is a cloud-based tool? As far as I know, there is no formal definition of those two terms. I can just tell you how we usually use that to bring that in some kind of context. Most often they're actually used together. Now, a web-based tool, I would consider a tool that uses web technologies, especially in the UI, like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, TypeScript, and so on. So mainly that means the UI is implemented for a browser engine, not, for example, based on Swing or SWT anymore. It uses then consequently a browser for UI rendering. That can be a real browser, or if you just deploy on the desktop, that could be Electron. And there's usually, in a web-based tool, there's a split between the UI written with web technologies and a backend. And typically the backend is responsible for the business logic, like calculating language features, compiling, and so on, while the UI is very slim and only contains the UI. The split is typically also there even when a tool is deployed on the desktop. Now, cloud-based would mean that the backend of such a tool is deployed remotely, so in the cloud somewhere, and the UI of a cloud-based tool is accessed either via the browser or, not forget this second option, via a desktop tool that connects to this backend. Now, two tendencies: cloud-based tools are usually web-based, kind of makes sense, and web-based tools are usually prepared for the cloud. Like you could see, for example, with VS Code, it was available as a desktop tool for quite a while, but it was kind of, the architecture was already prepared for the cloud, and that's a typical scheme for web-based tools. Now, how do those web and cloud-based tools usually work? What's a common architecture? How do they look like from an architecture point of view? So I mentioned before, in those tools, we have a tool front end running on the browser engine and a tool back end containing the business logic. From a technology point of view, the front end is a browser engine, typically in HTML, JavaScript, TypeScript, while the backend it's very common to have a Node.js backend serving the front end. However, very often you integrate other technologies on this backend too, for example, Java or C, especially for language features, but also for other features that are only available in a certain language. So it's fairly straightforward to integrate another technology on a Node.js backend as an external process or as an application that you run there. Now, those are the two building blocks of a typical web-based tool. And now the difference is if you deploy those two parts separately, you have a cloud setup. And if you bundle both together, you can do that with Electron, for example. You can still deploy that as a desktop tool. Main difference is then that the UI is completely different, and usually you are prepared for the cloud already. In this context, there is a very important concept called the language server protocol that is actually enabling the core of every IDE or text-focused tool, also called LSP. So let's quickly look at what that is. Now, the challenge that needs to be solved here is when we are working with a web-based UI that runs in the browser, for example, we want to show a code editor like we have here on screen. But when the user interacts with the code editor, for example, triggers the auto-completion, there needs to be some business logic calculating that. And this business logic needs to be aware of the source code, and very often the full project, because it, for example, needs to calculate all the possibilities that you can autocomplete, regardless of the actual language. And now in a web-based tool, there's a split. So we have this UI component. The most common one to use is the Monaco code editor provided by VS Code. And now this front end doesn't actually know about the language, and it doesn't understand the project. But what it does instead, it communicates with what's called a language server. In this example, it would be a Java language server, but there could be different languages. And now this language server that lives on the back end can communicate with the file system and actually parse source files. It can build an AST, it can do whatever it needs to do to fulfill the needs of the UI. And now the cool thing about this architecture, because this architecture is already enables the split between the business logic on the back end and the UI, the cool thing is that there is this defined protocol. And it's a standard protocol. And that actually means the UI part, and specifically the Monaco code editor, can talk to different language servers as long as they speak the same protocol. And there are actually already dozens of language servers available for different languages, even several for the same language. But you don't need to re-implement the code editor like the Webbased code editor. You just need to switch the language server on the backend to support different languages, all enabled by this language server protocol. So this was originally introduced by VS Code, but it's picked up by almost every web-based tool, including Eclipse Theia, for example. It's really a standard of how to implement source code language features in web-based tools. Now, I already mentioned VS Code and Theia quite a bit. So let's compare those two tools or projects. Disclaimer, I will not do a full comparison today. I did that last year, but just a quick pointer on what are the most important difference between those two projects. It's also worth mentioning, so we actually have customers on both platforms, and I really believe there are good use cases for both. I really like both projects, but there are some substantial differences that I would like to highlight. You can also see there is a link in the heading to an article that covers this topic much more in detail that I can do today due to time reasons. All right, so VS Code is, you could argue, the most popular code editor at the moment. It's really amazing. It has a great usability concept, a lot of innovation like the LSP and so on, very popular amongst developers. Eclipse Theia is very similar to VS Code. So if you start Theia or Theia-based tool, to be more precise, most developers would not even notice a difference. So it's very much oriented to get the best usability concepts of VS Code. VS Code is extensible via VS Code extensions. So VS Code is a tool that you can extend. It's meant as a ready-to-use tool, and then you can add some features using VS Code extensions. And Theia also allows the same. This is very important because all those thousands and thousands of VS Code extensions out there that provide certain features you can use them also in Theia and in VS Code. It's compatible in this sense. So let's talk about some differences. Those are things that they both have in common. Now, as just mentioned, VS Code is an extensible tool. It is not meant as a platform. So if you really need to adapt it, for example, to build a custom tool based on it, you might hit places where you need to fork it or where you need to work around something. And it actually also makes sense because VS Code just doesn't want to fulfill this this purpose. It's a extensible code editor, but it's not built as a platform for for example, for building white label tools. Theia in turn is really a platform. It's not meant as a ready-to-use tool, but meant as a platform to build tools. And consequently, it has a very flexible architecture, and you can really fully customize it to your needs. And very likely, you don't need to fork it. You can even replace core components of Theia without forking it, which is very convenient if you build custom tool distributions based on it. And that's its main purpose. And that's why it's not surprising that there's a difference here. Just to mention that VS Code is mainly controlled by one vendor. It's open source. Some parts of the project are not open source. For example, the online part is currently not open source. This is not necessarily a bad thing for the project. Actually, Microsoft does a great job in evolving this project. But it's kind of like they have really a lot of control over the project. It has advantages and disadvantages. Eclipse Theia is an Eclipse project, so it has a vendor-neutral governance. And it is worth mentioning that we, in recent years, we really see a lot of companies adopting Theia. So it has quite some momentum at the moment, especially in the embedded area. So that's a focus point at the moment for Theia, which also leads to, or which might lead to some features that are actually only available in Theia, not necessarily compatible with VS Code anymore. At the end of the day, this will not be enough for your project to make a decision. I'm aware of that. So I recommend reading this article that I linked, but also feel free to talk to me anytime. There are several places you can visit us at the booth to discuss this. Before you decide, I urge you to do a proper evaluation. I've seen projects adopting VS Code and regretting it because they needed to fork it a lot. But also, if you just want VS Code with some a little bit extensions, then Theia might be too extensible for you. So it might also not be the right choice. So really spend your time in evaluating this between the two platforms. It's worth mentioning that some vendors actually also follow a dual strategy. So they provide some features as a VS Code extension in the marketplace. You can get kind of the slim version of their tool. And then additionally, they provide a full tool distribution based on Theia, because then they can get the advantages of both worlds if you want. If you're interested in Theia, some example projects, you can see that's quite a who's who of software engineering here. So we have SAP, Google, ARM, Red Hat, Arduino, and so on. There are links on the slide that you can click. Slides are uploaded in the portal. So and on this slide, I actually only listed the tools that are publicly available. There's this dark matter of tools that are currently behind the walls. So not you cannot see them. They're not released yet, or maybe they're just internal tools. And there are actually quite a lot of them, as mentioned before. The last tool is actually the coffee editor. It's an example tool that we provide. I will talk a little bit more about that later. And another thing that I would like to mention about Theia. So I mentioned before that Theia is actually a platform to build tools. And that has been a shortcoming of the project for quite a while. That is a platform, but people who want to look at the project, they would like to see some example on how a tool based on Theia looks like. And there was actually not an open example there. This is what Blueprint delivers now. Blueprint is an example distribution provided by the Theia project. It comes as a desktop tool that you can install with installers for all operating system. And it serves mainly two purposes. One, you can just download it and install it and try it and use it. So you see what Theia can do. And second, if you want to build an own tool based on Theia, you can use this as a template because it's very easy to customize that. add the features you need in your tool, and there's even documentation for this. This was actually a contribution or a collaboration between ARM, ST Microelectronics, Eclipse Source, and Ericsson worked together on providing this. Now from something completely different, not completely different, related. You might have heard of a project called openVSX. So how does that fit in the ecosystem, and what's the purpose of this project? Now, I mentioned before that VS Code is extensible by so-called VS Code extensions, and there's the VS Code marketplace that hosts thousands of those extensions for all kind of purposes. And you can, from within VS Code, you can download and directly install them, which is great. It's a huge ecosystem. Unfortunately, the VS Code marketplace does not allow other tools to connect to it. So while you could, from a compatibility point of view, install all those extensions, for example, in Theia or other tools based on Theia, you're not allowed to use the marketplace. Now, to circumvent this, the community has actually developed the openVSX registry. This was kicked off by Typefox and then later on contributed and handed over to the Eclipse Foundation that hosts openVSX now. So it's essentially fulfilling the same feature set as the VS Code marketplace, hosting VS Code extensions, but you can connect to it from any kind of tool. And that includes any tool that is based on Eclipse Theia, like all the tools I've shown you before. Gitpod, for example, uses it. VS Codium uses it as a default. So it's a very open solution. And it contains, I would say, the most important extensions today. So it doesn't have the same number as the VS Code marketplace, but I never saw something that I missed there. So it's really, really a good alternative. And by the way, you can even connect VS Code to openVSX if you want. It's also worth mentioning that openVSX itself, like the software, is completely open source, and you can even install that yourself. So for example, if you want an in-house marketplace with some restrictions on what developers can install, you can also adopt openVSX conveniently without any license issues. Now, from something completely different, let's talk about hosting. So when you build cloud-based tools, you need some hosting solution for the backend. And this is not the same as hosting typical business application. The main reason for that is if the backend of a developer tool needs a lot of access or power in terms of access. So you need access to file system, you need to be able to run compilers, analyze tools or whatever. So it really needs a lot of writes on the backend. And how to deal with that typically is you encapsulate the backend of such a web-based tool, or cloud-based tool in this case, into a container, usually a Docker container, and you kind of run a virtual machine for a developer on the server. And every developer now has their own virtual machine. We call that a workspace container. So this container contains the source files for a project, plus all the tools like Git, the compilers, and so on. And it also serves the tool front end, in this picture, a browser IDE. And now, while you can imagine, okay, I set up a Docker container on a server, what's then an unsolved problem is how to manage a group of developers. Like, they need some way to create their workspace containers, to stop them. You need to manage the access to the workspace containers for all those developers and so on. So you need some sort of management instance that keeps track on and manages all those workspace container instances. And that's what Eclipse Che provides. So it's an open source project again, and it provides a workspace container management server. It's based on Kubernetes. And you can actually, you have a dashboard and some workspace management, so people can log in. They can decide, okay, I need a workspace container for Spring development. And then the system instantiates that for me, provides access. I can code in the container. I can commit the code. I can stop. I can start it. I can even modify the templates. For example, for certain projects, you can really get to a one-click setup there with those solutions. There are other workspace server solutions there, for example, Gitpod or even VS Code Spaces, but Eclipse Che is the open source implementation that's hosted at the Eclipse Foundation and backed up by Red Hat. All right. I lost the focus. Now, again, from something completely different, how to migrate to web-based tools. That is one of the questions that I could easily do another presentation about, involving also the question, can I reuse pieces of my existing tool, which is for many tool chains that have been developed over 20 years or more, a very crucial question. And because I could do another presentation about this topic, I decided to submit one, and luckily it got accepted too. And I will hold it today at 4:50 in room 4. It's called Migrating Eclipse based tools and plugins to Eclipse Theia or VS Code. So if you're interested in this topic, please feel free to, or I invite you to join my other presentation today. And sorry that I skipped this question for this talk today. What I want to quickly cover, though, is how to build domain-specific tools. Like what the strength of the Eclipse platform has always been that it's not only about like pure IDE features like source code, but also involve things like building DSLs, diagrams, form-based editors, and so on. So what other technologies are there? Like what about GMF? What about Xtext and so on? How are those technologies replaced when you go to the cloud? Now, disclaimer, this list is by far not complete. I just tried to pick the 4 most important or most frequent seen features that you might have in a domain-specific tool, and what are candidates to use for a web-based tool. Now, Xtext, there are a lot of Xtext-based tools out there. How to replace that in a web-based tool where you need to use where you actually need a language server. The good news is you can actually create a language server with Xtext. So instead of generating like the editor support for Eclipse, you would generate a language server then with Xtext based on the same grammar that you're used to. And then you actually connect, for example, the Monaco code editor to the language server and use your custom DSL. Very, very powerful, cool feature that Xtext supports, and it still keeps the framework very relevant. For diagrams, you might have a tool based on GMF or GEF. Those technologies are not really suited for web-based tools, but there are alternatives. Most commonly, a project called Eclipse GLSP, that stands for Graphical Language Server Platform. This is very similar to LSP, but for diagrams. It's a diagram framework for web-based tools. It's based on Sprotty. It's very powerful, so you can build very, very comprehensive diagram editors based on web-based tools. And it can be used in VS Code and Theia or even outside of any platform. It's worth mentioning there's also a web version of Sirius in the meantime called Sirius Web, and there are also talks on this conference about that. EMF ecosystem, you might use things like EMF Compare, EMF itself, or EMF validation. There's a project called EMF Cloud that aims at making EMF usable in the cloud context or re-implementing some parts of it that are not directly reusable. So have a look at that. And for form-based UIs, there is a framework frequently adapted for tools called JSON Forms. Now, if you want to learn more about those technologies, I strongly recommend to visit their project website, but I can also point to some talks, especially one about GLSP, diagram editors with GLSP, which is the next session right after this one in room 2. And 2 talks about EMF Cloud. One is a general overview about current features at feature development called Model Validation, Diffing, and More with EMF Cloud on Wednesday at 5:10 in room 1, and another experience report, how to build model application with Theia and EMF Cloud, the Disco experience. So that's kind of migrating the Disco project in the cloud with those technologies on Thursday, 4:50. And just browse the program. There is much more to discover about those, about this topic. I also want to mention one openly available example on a domain-specific tool called the Coffee Editor. It's a little bit like Blueprint. It's an example to showcase how to build web-based tools, and is specifically focused on the DSL, diagram, form-based editor, code generator, analysis, and so on. So just click the link. There's an online demonstration, and the source code is fully available. Probably also a good blueprint for your project. Finally, and then it's enough about references, I want to mention above that happens tomorrow evening about this topic, like how to build tools based on Eclipse, web-based tools. It's an event where it's an informal event where a couple of experts will join, and you can openly ask questions about your project, about specific technology, and we try to cover as much as we can there. Yeah, to come to a conclusion, what else is there? One thing that I want to mention, that there is a very active working group. It's called the Eclipse Cloud Developer Tools working group. And this working group actually supports this part of the ecosystem. So quite a few vendors collaborate here on technical initiatives and on pushing the ecosystem forward to make it known to people, increase project adoption, and so on. So if you're interested in strategically learning about this ecosystem and even joining it and influencing it, then click this link and learn more on the website. And with that, I would like to open it for questions. And while I take them, please also consider to evaluate the session on the homepage. And now I'm happy to take any questions. Okay, so let's look at the question. I think the most popular question here is, will Theia replace the traditional Eclipse IDE and RCP? It's a good question. So first of all, I think it's the next logical step. If you want to go towards web-based tool, then Theia is a very good alternative. Will it really replace the existing desktop IDE? Maybe over time. It is worth mentioning that not every project is currently migrating. I would say some projects directly go to a web-based tool, and some are already published. Many of them are currently evaluating or in the process of preparing that. And there are also projects where a web-based or a cloud-based tool doesn't really bring a huge advantage yet. And they are still on the desktop platform. So I would expect that the desktop platform will be there for another 5 or 10 years. I mean, I cannot really say. But if you have an existing tool, it's definitely worth looking at those alternatives. And Theia is one great alternative if you want to migrate to the web, because at some point in time, you probably will need to migrate. Second most popular question was, are there alternatives to VS Code extensions? I've read about Theia plugins. Is this still a valid way of customizing the tool? So without going too much into detail, the two things you're probably interested in are VS Code extensions and Theia extensions. VS Code extensions are compatible with both, so you can use it in Theia and VS Code, while Theia extensions are the second mechanism only provided by Theia that is more powerful, and really you can do adoptions in the core of Theia. I will actually have a talk, I think it was mentioned even in the chat, I will have a talk about migrating Eclipse plugins to Theia or VS Code, and I will answer this question more in detail because I don't have much time now. So if you're interested in details, please join this talk. And third question, and then I think I'm done. What about openVSX server? Recently announced. What do you think about this initiative? It's an interesting one. It actually opens the server implementation for VS Code, and it actually makes it easier to run VS Code in the cloud. This doesn't really change, from my point of view, the comparison between Theia and VS Code. Like without this initiatives, it's kind of really cumbersome to run VS Code in the cloud, because you kind of have to hack this together yourself or implement the server part. And now there are several tools running online based on VS Code already that are not code spaces, and all of those tools had to provide their own implementation. And now with this initiatives, they can actually base their servers on the same code, which is, I think, a great thing. So if you want to go for VS Code, then this is really a great initiative, and it kind of fills the gap. Otherwise, if you wanted to run in the cloud, VS Code was really not a good alternative. So this is changed by this. And I think we have less than 1 minute left. I want to close here. Please, again, I invite you to join my second talk, which goes a little bit more about the question how to migrate from desktop, from an existing desktop Eclipse product or plugin to the web. Thank you for attending this session.